The quiet storm. Thea Hollis had learned to make herself small. At Lincoln High School in suburban Denver, she perfected the art of invisibility, keeping her head down as she navigated the crowded hallways each morning, her shoulders hunched inward, her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum tiles beneath her worn sneakers. She was shorter than most students, barely reaching 5'3", with a slight frame that looked almost fragile beneath her oversized hoodies and loose jeans. Her dark hair hung in a simple ponytail, no makeup on her pale face, nothing to draw attention. She moved through the school like a ghost, slipping between groups of laughing students, never making eye contact, never speaking unless spoken to first. Most students at Lincoln didn't know her name, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The school itself sprawled across several acres, a 3-story brick building with wings branching out like spokes from a central hub. The main hallway stretched nearly a quarter-mile from the front entrance to the gymnasium, lined with dented metal lockers painted industrial grey. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow. The cafeteria occupied the ground floor of the east wing, a cavernous space with long tables arranged in rows, always smelling of industrial pizza and bleach. The gymnasium dominated the west wing, its polished hardwood floors gleaming under massive overhead lights, bleachers folded against the walls. Outside, the football field stretched behind the building, surrounded by a cracked running track and rusted chain-link fencing. Lincoln High had a reputation as a decent school, neither prestigious nor troubled, serving a middle-class neighborhood where most parents worked regular jobs and most students aimed for state colleges. Thea had arrived at Lincoln at the beginning of the semester, transferring in from across the country with no explanation, no fanfare, no friends. The administration had placed her in classes without ceremony, and she'd slipped into the routine of attending school like someone serving a sentence. She sat in the back of every classroom, completed her assignments without participating in discussions, ate lunch alone at the edge of the cafeteria near the emergency exit. She carried a battered backpack that looked too heavy for her small frame, and she always kept her gym bag locked in her locker, never leaving it unattended, never opening it where others could see inside. The first time she encountered Garrett Vance, it was in the hallway outside the science wing on a Tuesday morning during the second week of school. Garrett was impossible to miss, standing 6'2", with the build of someone who spent hours in the weight room, broad shoulders straining against his Lincoln Lions football jersey, blonde hair styled with too much gel. He moved through the hallways like he owned them, surrounded by his inner circle, students parting to let him pass. His family owned the largest car dealership in the county, and his father sat on the school board. Facts Garrett mentioned frequently and loudly. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, never facing real consequences, never having to consider anyone else's feelings or boundaries. That first encounter was minor, barely worth remembering. Thea had been moving along the wall toward her biology class when Garrett and his friends came the opposite direction. She'd tried to slip past, to make herself even smaller, but Garrett had bumped into her shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling sideways, her backpack swinging. His friends had laughed, and Garrett had glanced back with a smirk, not bothering to apologize, not even really seeing her as a person. Thea had steadied herself against the wall, waited for them to pass, then continued to class without reaction. Her heart had hammered in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system, but she'd breathed through it, controlled it, pushed it down into the deep well where she kept everything else. The second incident came 3 days later in the cafeteria. Thea had been carrying her lunch tray toward her usual isolated table when Garrett's friend, a stocky wrestler named Bryce Carmichael, had deliberately stepped into her path. She'd stopped short, nearly dropping her tray, and Bryce had looked down at her with mock surprise. "Oops, didn't see you there, mouse," he'd said, and his friends had snickered. Thea had waited silently until he moved aside, then walked past without speaking. She'd felt their eyes on her back, heard the whispered comments, but she'd kept moving. At her table, sitting alone, she'd forced herself to eat despite her churning stomach, forced herself to appear unbothered, forced herself to think about anything except the promise she'd made. By the end of the third week, a pattern had established itself. Garrett and his core group, Bryce, a lanky basketball player named Cole Jennings, and Garrett's on-and-off girlfriend, a cheerleader named Tasha Reed, had identified Thea as an easy target. It started small, almost casual, books knocked from her hands in the hallway, shoulders checking her as they passed, snide comments just loud enough for her to hear. "Where'd you even come from? Does she ever talk? Probably can't afford decent clothes." Thea endured it all in silence, bending to pick up her scattered books, continuing to class without responding, giving them nothing. Some part of her hoped they'd get bored, move on to more interesting prey, leave her alone if she refused to react. But silence didn't discourage them. If anything, it seemed to encourage them, to make her more appealing as a victim. By the fourth week, the incidents escalated. Her locker was covered in sticky notes one morning, crude drawings, and mocking words about her appearance, her clothes, her lack of friends. Thea had removed them methodically, crumpling each one and dropping it in the trash, her face expressionless, even as her hands trembled slightly. In the bathroom, she'd locked herself in a stall and breathed deeply, counting to 10 over and over, thinking about her father's voice. "Control is everything, Thea. Never let them see you break. Never give them the reaction they want." Her father had been her first coach, her only coach, really. He'd been a Marine before he opened his small MMA gym in Philadelphia, a bare-bones facility in a rough neighborhood where he taught self-defense to working-class people who couldn't afford fancy martial arts studios. Thea had grown up in that gym, learning to wrap her hands before she learned long division, drilling takedowns and submissions while other girls her age were playing with dolls. Her father had been patient but demanding, teaching her not just techniques but philosophy. Fighting was a tool, not a solution, something to be used only when absolutely necessary, a last resort when all other options had been exhausted. He'd trained champions, sent students to regional and national competitions, but he'd always told Thea that real strength meant walking away, that anyone could throw a punch. But it took true discipline to choose peace. He'd died 2 years ago, suddenly, a heart attack, while closing up the gym late one evening. Thea had been 15, and her world had collapsed. The gym closed shortly after, sold to pay debts she hadn't known existed. She and her mother had struggled, bounced between relatives, eventually landing in Denver with her mother's sister, starting over in a place where no one knew them. And Thea had made a decision. She would leave that part of her life behind. No more fighting, no more training, no more competitions. Her father had taught her that violence was a last resort, and she would honor him by never using what he'd taught her, by choosing peace no matter what. She'd packed her gloves, her hand wraps, her shin guards deep in her gym bag and locked it away, promising herself and his memory that she'd never open it again. The fourth week brought the incident in computer lab. Thea had been working on an assignment focused on her screen when someone poured water on her keyboard. The computer sparked and died, and the teacher had turned around angry, demanding to know who was responsible. No one spoke up, but Thea saw Cole Jennings tucking an empty water bottle into his backpack, saw Garrett and Bryce smirking from across the room. The teacher had blamed Thea for being careless, made her stay after class to clean up, threatened her with paying for the damaged equipment. Thea had cleaned silently, wiped up every drop of water, and said nothing about what had actually happened. Speaking up would only make things worse, and she'd learned that in her old neighborhood. Never snitch, never complain, handle your own problems or endure them. That weekend, alone in her aunt's small house while her mother worked a double shift at the hospital, Thea sat on her bed and stared at the locked gym bag in her closet. She could feel her father's gloves in there, worn leather that had molded to her hands over hundreds of hours of training. She remembered the weight of them, the smell of leather and sweat, the sound of her fists connecting with heavy bags. She remembered the feeling of being good at something, of being confident, of walking through the world without fear, but she'd made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Violence had taken her father from her, not direct violence, but the stress of running a gym in a dangerous neighborhood, the constant tension, the wear on his body from years of fighting. She wouldn't continue that cycle. She'd find another way. Monday morning arrived cold and grey. November settling over Denver with early snow flurries that melted on contact with the sidewalk. Thea walked to school alone, her breath misting in the air, her hood pulled up against the wind. The hallways were crowded and loud, students clustered at lockers, couples pressed against walls, groups comparing weekend stories. Thea moved through them invisibly, reached her locker, spun the combination, and pulled out her books for first period. Behind her she heard Garrett's distinctive laugh, that braying sound that carried across any room. She didn't turn around, just closed her locker and started walking. The shoulder bump came hard enough to spin her around, send her books scattering across the floor. Garrett was there with Bryce and Cole, all three of them in their football jerseys, fresh from some morning weight training session. "Oops," Garrett said, not even slowing down. "Watch where you're going, Ghost." They kept walking, and the hallway noise continued, everyone seeing what happened, but no one stopping to help. Thea knelt and gathered her books, her face burning, her chest tight. A few students stepped around her carefully, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to notice. One girl, someone Thea didn't know, dark-skinned with her hair in intricate braids, paused as if she might stop, might say something, but then kept walking, her face guilty. In the cafeteria that day, Thea sat alone, as always, at the table furthest from the main seating area, near the trash cans and the emergency exit. She'd brought lunch from home, a simple sandwich and an apple, trying to save money, trying not to be a burden on her mother and aunt. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, watching the room without appearing to watch. The cafeteria was tribal, territories clearly marked. Football players dominated the center tables, cheerleaders arranged themselves nearby, various cliques radiating outward in order of social importance. The outcasts and loners, people like Thea, occupied the periphery, the edges, the forgotten corners. Garrett sat at his usual table, surrounded by admirers, holding court like a king among subjects. Tasha Reed perched on his lap despite teachers walking past, her cheerleading uniform spotless, her makeup perfect. Bryce and Cole flanked them, along with several other football players and cheerleaders, their laughter loud and performative. Occasionally Garrett would glance around the cafeteria, his eyes scanning for entertainment, for someone to mock, for an opportunity to reinforce his position at the top of the social hierarchy. The fifth week brought escalation. Someone spread a rumor that Thea smelled bad, that she didn't shower, that she was dirty. Students started holding their noses theatrically when she walked past, making exaggerated gagging sounds. It wasn't true. Thea showered every morning, kept her clothes clean, was scrupulous about hygiene. But truth didn't matter. The rumor spread through social media, through whispered conversations, through the invisible networks that controlled teenage social life. In the bathroom, Thea overheard two girls discussing whether she was homeless, whether she lived in a shelter, where her family was. She'd stayed silent in her stall until they left, then washed her hands and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. Her eyes looked tired, dark circles underneath, her skin pale. She looked exactly like what she was, someone barely holding on. That Friday, someone put a dead rat in her locker. Thea opened it during passing period, and the smell hit her first. Then she saw the small grey body, stiff and crawling with ants. Students around her recoiled, made disgusted sounds, moved away quickly. A teacher came over, demanded to know what happened, and Thea had to explain. The teacher had the janitor remove it, then lectured Thea about keeping her locker clean, about not storing food, completely missing the obvious truth that someone had done this deliberately. Through it all, Thea stood silent, face expressionless, while down the hallway Garrett and his friends watched and laughed. The 6th week was when things got truly bad. Someone created a fake social media account in Thea's name, posting crude and embarrassing content, tagging Lincoln High students, trying to destroy whatever microscopic reputation she had. Thea didn't even have social media. She'd avoided it deliberately, wanting no digital footprint. But now her name was attached to posts she'd never written, pictures she'd never taken, comments that made her seem pathetic and desperate. The school administration did nothing, claiming they couldn't police students' personal social media, suggesting Thea report it to the platforms themselves. That process would take weeks, and in the meantime, the damage was done. She started eating lunch off campus when possible, walking to a small park 3 blocks away, sitting alone on a bench, trying to find 20 minutes of peace. But the weather was getting colder, and she couldn't always escape. On the days she stayed, she ate quickly, trying to minimize her time in the cafeteria, always aware of Garrett's table, always tracking their positions like a prey animal watching predators. It was during the 7th week that Thea first saw Kieran Adler. He was in her English class, had been all semester, but she'd never really noticed him beyond registering his presence. He sat 3 rows over, always participated in discussions, always had thoughtful things to say about whatever novel they were reading. He had messy brown hair that fell into his eyes, wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of doodling in the margins of his notebook. He dressed in thrift store clothes that somehow looked deliberately chosen, rather than desperately affordable. Band t-shirts for groups Thea had never heard of, worn jeans, beat-up Converse sneakers. That day, the teacher had assigned group work, and through random selection, Thea ended up paired with Kieran and 2 other students. The others immediately started chatting, making plans to split up the work over text message, barely acknowledging Thea's existence. But Kieran had looked at her directly, made eye contact and said, "Hey, you're Thea, right? I liked your essay on The Great Gatsby." The part about Gatsby's obsession being a form of self-destruction was really insightful. Thea had been so surprised that someone remembered her name, had read her work, had something positive to say, that she'd just nodded, unable to form words. Kieran had smiled, not seeming bothered by her silence, and continued, "Want to work on the character analysis together? We could meet in the library after school if you want." Thea had almost said no, almost retreated into her fortress of isolation, but something about Kieran's genuine smile, his lack of judgment, made her hesitate. "Okay," she'd said quietly, her voice rusty from disuse. It was the first real conversation she'd had with a peer at Lincoln High, and it felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. The library was on the 3rd floor, a relatively quiet space with rows of books, study tables, and a few ancient computers. After school that day, Thea found Kieran already there, spread out at a corner table with his books and laptop, 2 bottles of iced tea sitting beside his stuff. "Wasn't sure what you liked, so I got lemon," he said, pushing 1 bottle toward her. "Hope that's okay." They'd worked on the assignment for over an hour, Kieran doing most of the talking at first, but gradually drawing Thea out, asking her opinion, listening when she spoke. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into why she was so quiet, didn't seem bothered by her silence. He just treated her like a normal person, and Thea had forgotten how good that felt. Over the next 2 weeks, they met several more times, ostensibly to work on class projects, but really just to talk. Kieran told her about his obsession with indie music, his dreams of being a filmmaker, his complicated relationship with his divorced parents. Thea found herself opening up in small ways, talking about books she loved, movies she'd seen, carefully edited stories from her past that omitted anything about fighting or training. She learned that Kieran was smart and funny and kind, that he volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, that he saw the world in interesting ways, and he seemed genuinely interested in her, in what she thought, in who she was beneath her protective shell. Garrett noticed. Of course he noticed. In the cafeteria one day during the 9th week, Thea and Kieran were eating lunch together at her usual isolated table, laughing about something, and Garrett's eyes locked onto them from across the room. Thea saw it happen, saw the calculation in his expression, saw him lean over and whisper something to Bryce and Cole. Her stomach dropped, and she knew immediately that she'd made a terrible mistake. By letting someone in, by showing that she cared about something, she'd given Garrett a new weapon to use against her. The next day, Kieran's locker was vandalized, spray-painted with slurs that the school administration had to cover up immediately. Kieran seemed confused about why he'd suddenly become a target, but Thea knew exactly why. She tried to distance herself from him, tried to protect him by going back to eating alone, but Kieran wouldn't let her. "Whatever's happening, we deal with it together," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." And despite her fear, despite knowing she was putting him in danger, Thea felt something warm in her chest, something she hadn't felt since her father died. Hope. The 10th week brought the cafeteria incident that Thea would replay in her mind for weeks afterward. She and Kieran were sitting together again, talking about their plans for Thanksgiving break, when Garrett and his entire crew approached their table. The cafeteria noise seemed to dim, students sensing something about to happen, turning to watch. Garrett stood directly across from Thea, looking down at her with his practiced smirk, his friends arrayed behind him like an army. "So the ghost found herself a boyfriend," Garrett said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "That's cute. Does he know you're a complete freak? Does he know nobody wanted to sit with you until he took pity on you?" Kieran started to stand, to defend Thea, but she grabbed his arm, shook her head. Responding would only make it worse. Garrett leaned closer, his hands planted on their table. "What's wrong, Ghost? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too pathetic to speak up for yourself?" His breath smelled like energy drinks and protein bars. Behind him, Cole was recording on his phone, capturing every moment for later distribution, for permanent humiliation. Thea stared at her lunch tray, willing herself to disappear, to become invisible again. But Kieran wouldn't stay quiet. "Leave her alone, Garrett," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "What's your problem? Why do you have to be such an asshole?" The cafeteria went completely silent. No one talked to Garrett like that. No one challenged him directly. Even the lunch staff had stopped moving, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Garrett's smile widened, but his eyes went cold. "Oh, the boyfriend has a mouth on him," he said. Then, moving fast, he grabbed Kieran's tray and flipped it, sending food flying across the table and onto Kieran's lap. Spaghetti sauce stained Kieran's shirt. Meatballs rolled across the floor. Milk splattered everywhere. Students gasped, some laughed, everyone stared. Kieran sat frozen, covered in food, his face red with humiliation. And then Garrett reached for Thea's tray. What happened next occurred in slow motion. Garrett's hand moved toward her tray, clearly intending to humiliate her the same way, to complete the performance, to cement his dominance. Thea watched his hand moving, watched his smug expression, watched the phone recording everything, and something inside her shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Like a tectonic plate slipping after building pressure for weeks. She thought about her father, about his lessons, about choosing peace, about walking away. But there was nowhere left to walk. They'd taken everything from her, her anonymity, her safety, her dignity. And now they were taking the one good thing she'd found at this school, the one person who'd shown her kindness. Her hand moved before her brain consciously decided to move it. As Garrett's fingers touched her tray, Thea's hand snapped out and caught his wrist. her grip iron-tight, her fingers finding pressure points with practiced precision. Garrett's eyes widened in surprise, then pain. He tried to pull away, but Thea's grip was unbreakable, her hand positioned perfectly to control his entire arm. Around them, the cafeteria went dead silent, everyone sensing that something fundamental had just changed. "Don't," Thea said quietly, her voice steady and cold, nothing like the meek silence she'd maintained for months. She looked directly into Garrett's eyes, and what he saw there made him take an involuntary step back when she released his wrist. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by confusion and the first flicker of uncertainty. Thea stood slowly, and though she was nearly a foot shorter than Garrett, something about her posture, her presence, made her seem suddenly dangerous. "Thea," Kieran started, but she held up her other hand, silencing him gently. Garrett recovered quickly, his ego unable to tolerate being challenged, especially in front of an audience. "Oh, so the ghost can fight back?" he sneered. But there was an edge to his voice now, uncertainty bleeding through the bravado. "That's cute. You think you're tough now?" He looked back at Bryce and Cole, needing their support, needing witnesses to whatever he was about to do. "Guys, looks like we need to teach the ghost a lesson about respect." Bryce moved forward first, bigger than Garrett, his wrestler's build all compact muscle and low center of gravity. He reached for Thea's shoulder, intending to shove her, to put her in her place. What happened next was so fast that most students would debate later about exactly what they saw. Thea's body simply wasn't where Bryce expected it to be. She'd shifted her weight, angled offline, and suddenly Bryce was stumbling forward off balance. Thea's hand touched his extended arm, barely a touch, just a gentle redirect, and Bryce's own momentum sent him crashing into the table behind her, food and trays scattering. The cafeteria erupted in shocked gasps and nervous laughter. Bryce scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You bitch!" he started, but Thea had already moved again, positioning herself between Kieran and the rest of Garrett's crew. Her stance had changed completely, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, hands loose and ready, her entire body language transformed from passive victim to something else entirely. Cole came next, his basketball player height giving him reach advantage. He swung a wild punch, no technique, just rage and humiliation, expecting to connect with Thea's face. She slipped the punch effortlessly, her head moving just enough, and Cole's fist sailed harmlessly past her ear. Before he could recover, Thea stepped in close, her small frame sliding inside his reach, and did something with her hip and his leg that sent him toppling sideways into Bryce, who was just getting up. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and now the cafeteria was on its feet, students pressing closer to see, phones out everywhere, recording from every angle. Garrett stood there, his face cycling through emotions, shock, disbelief, fear, rage. Around him, his social empire was crumbling as his two enforcers struggled to stand up, taken down by a girl they'd been tormenting for weeks, a girl who was a foot shorter than both of them, a girl who should have been an easy victim. "What the hell?" Garrett managed, and Thea turned to face him fully. "I don't want to fight you," Thea said, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly through the now silent cafeteria. "I never wanted to fight anyone. I just want to be left alone." But even as she said it, she knew it was too late for that. The door had been opened, the secret partially revealed, and there was no going back to invisible now. Garrett's face hardened, his pride unable to accept what had just happened. He was the alpha, the dominant male, the one everyone feared and respected. He couldn't let this stand, couldn't walk away, couldn't show weakness in front of the entire school. "You think you're tough?" he spat, and he came at her with all his football training, his weight advantage, his belief in his own superiority. He threw a haymaker punch, the kind of telegraphed attack that worked in fights against untrained opponents, the kind that relied on size and power rather than skill. Thea didn't even look concerned. She stepped in and to the side, her footwork perfect, years of training making her movements fluid and economical. She caught Garrett's punching arm at the wrist and elbow, controlled it, redirected his momentum, and then, still not striking him, still trying to avoid hurting him, she swept his legs out from under him with a textbook Ashibarai, a basic judo foot sweep her father had taught her when she was 8 years old. Garrett went down hard, his back slamming against the cafeteria floor, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The sound echoed through the room, final and definitive. Thea stood over him, not gloating, not celebrating, her expression almost sad. "Stay down," she said quietly. "Please, just stay down." But Garrett's pride wouldn't let him. Wheezing, furious, humiliated beyond anything he'd ever experienced, he struggled to his feet. Bryce and Cole were up too now, circling around, and Tasha was screaming something, and phones were recording from every angle, and teachers were finally pushing through the crowd, and everything was chaos and noise and movement. Garrett charged again, this time going for a tackle, using his football training, trying to drive Thea to the ground where his weight advantage would matter. Thea waited until the last possible moment, then executed a perfect sprawl, dropping her hips back and spreading her base, a fundamental wrestling defense. Garrett's arms closed on empty air, and his momentum carried him forward into nothing. Thea's hand pressed on the back of his head as he passed, not hard, just guidance. And Garrett face-planted into the cafeteria floor again, sliding several feet on the polished surface. Now teachers were there, shouting, pulling students apart, demanding everyone back up. The assistant principal, a tall black woman named Ms. Washington, pushed through the crowd and took in the scene. Garrett face down on the floor, Bryce and Cole disheveled and breathing hard. Thea standing calm and controlled in the center of it all, not even breathing heavily, Kieran still at their table covered in spaghetti sauce. "Everyone to my office now," Ms. Washington commanded, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The walk to the administrative office was surreal. Students parted to let them pass, whispering, staring, phones still recording. Thea walked with her head up for the first time in months, no longer trying to be invisible, no longer capable of it. Kieran walked beside her, dried sauce stiffening on his shirt, looking at her with a mixture of awe and concern and about 1,000 questions. Behind them, Garrett limped along, his nose bloody from the faceplant, his pride shattered, while Bryce and Cole supported each other, both nursing bruised egos and twisted ankles. In Ms. Washington's office, the interrogation began. Garrett immediately launched into his version. Thea had attacked him unprovoked. She was crazy, dangerous, should be expelled immediately. Bryce and Cole backed him up, spinning a narrative about an unhinged student snapping violently. Tasha, called in as a witness, tearfully supported her boyfriend's story, though her eyes kept darting to Thea with something that looked like fear. Ms. Washington listened to all of this without expression, then turned to Thea. "Well, what do you have to say about these accusations?" Thea took a deep breath, looked at Kieran, who nodded encouragingly, and then spoke. "Garrett reached for my lunch tray to flip it, just like he'd done to Kieran's tray seconds earlier. I caught his wrist and told him not to. He escalated. I defended myself, that's all." Her voice was calm, factual, empty of emotion. "If you check everyone's phones, you'll have multiple videos showing exactly what happened. I never threw a punch. I never initiated contact. I just didn't let them hit me." Ms. Washington studied her for a long moment, and Thea could see the administrator's mind working, calculating, assessing. "And where exactly did a student your size learn to handle 3 athletes like that?" Thea's jaw tightened. "My father owned an MMA gym. He trained me from when I was young. He died 2 years ago. I haven't trained since, haven't fought since. I promised him I'd never use violence. But they kept pushing, and today they went after someone I care about." She glanced at Kieran. I didn't hurt them. I could have. I didn't. The office was silent for a moment, everyone processing this information. Garrett looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, the reality sinking in that he'd been picking on someone who could have destroyed him at any point, but had chosen not to. Ms. Washington pulled out her phone and made several calls, and within 20 minutes, several students had been pulled from class, students who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident, students who'd recorded video. The videos told the story clearly. Garrett flipping Kieran's tray, reaching for Thea's, Thea defending herself without throwing a single strike, Garrett and his friends attacking, Thea controlling them with minimal force. It was textbook self-defense, impossible to dispute. Ms. Washington watched the videos multiple times, her expression growing darker with each viewing. Finally, she looked at Garrett and his friends. Get out of my office. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Your parents have been called. If even half of what I'm hearing about your treatment of Ms. Hollis is true, you're lucky she's not pressing assault charges against you. After they left, Ms. Washington turned to Thea, her expression softer. Are you okay? Thea nodded, not trusting her voice. I need to understand something. You have these skills, this training, and you never reported the bullying? Never defended yourself until now? Thea looked down at her hands, small hands that could do significant damage if she let them. My dad taught me that fighting should always be the last resort, that real strength is choosing not to fight. I was trying to honor him, trying to be better than my circumstances, but they put someone else in danger today, someone who only became a target because he was kind to me. I couldn't let that continue. Ms. Washington nodded slowly. I understand, and I'm sorry. We failed you. Multiple staff members have reported seeing interactions between you and Garrett's group over the past months, but no one intervened effectively. That's on us, on this administration. It shouldn't have taken you defending yourself for us to take action. She paused, then continued. I'll need you to write a complete statement about everything that's happened since you arrived at Lincoln. Every incident, every witness, everything. Can you do that? Thea nodded. And Thea, you're not in trouble. You defended yourself appropriately and with remarkable restraint. But I do need to inform your parent or guardian about what happened today. Thea's mother arrived an hour later, leaving work early, her face worried and scared. When she saw Thea sitting calmly in the office, uninjured, she nearly collapsed with relief. In Ms. Washington's private office, Thea explained everything, the months of bullying, the escalation, the final confrontation. Her mother's face cycled through emotions, anger, sadness, pride, fear. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice breaking. Thea's eyes filled with tears. Because I didn't want you to worry. You're already working so hard, and I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just stayed invisible, stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone. Her mother pulled her into a tight hug, and for the first time since the cafeteria incident, Thea let herself cry, really cry, months of suppressed fear and stress and loneliness pouring out. You're not alone, baby, her mother whispered. You don't have to handle everything by yourself. I'm your mother. Protecting you is my job, not the other way around. They held each other while Miss Washington discreetly looked away, giving them privacy in the moment. That evening, at her aunt's house, Thea finally opened her gym bag. Her gloves were there, worn and familiar, the leather cracked from use, her father's signature on each wrist from when he'd given them to her for her 12th birthday. She held them, breathed in the smell of old leather and memories, and for the first time since his death, she didn't feel guilty about being a fighter. Her father had taught her control, discipline, restraint, and today she'd used all of those lessons perfectly. She hadn't hurt anyone, hadn't given in to rage, hadn't become what Garrett was. She'd simply refused to be a victim anymore, and in doing so, she'd honored everything her father had taught her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kieran. You okay? That was intense, still processing everything. But also, you're kind of amazing. Want to talk? Thea smiled, her first genuine smile in months, and typed back, "Tomorrow. And thank you for today, for standing up for me, for being a friend when I had none." The response came immediately, "Tomorrow." "And Thea, I was right about your Gatsby essay. You're way more insightful than you let people see. Looking forward to learning more about the real you." The next morning, returning to Lincoln felt different. Thea walked through the front entrance with her shoulders back, her head up, no longer trying to disappear. Students stared, whispered, moved aside to let her pass. But the energy was different now. Some looks were fearful, some hostile, but many were respectful, even admiring. In the hallway outside her locker, the girl with braids, whose name she learned was Sienna, approached nervously. "Hey, I just wanted to say, I should have helped before. When they were messing with you, I'm sorry I didn't. But what you did yesterday, that took real courage." Thea nodded, accepting the apology. "Thank you. And if you see it happening to someone else, maybe don't wait next time." Sienna nodded seriously. "I won't. I promise." Throughout the morning, similar interactions occurred. Students who'd pretended not to notice the bullying now offered belated apologies, belated support. Teachers who'd looked the other way now made eye contact, nodded respectfully. The social hierarchy at Lincoln had been disrupted, and everyone was recalibrating their positions. At lunch, Thea and Kieran sat together at her usual table. But now, they weren't alone. Sienna joined them, and then a shy boy named Felix who'd been dealing with his own bullying, and then two girls from Thea's biology class, and suddenly the isolated corner table was full, was lively, was almost normal. They talked and laughed, and Thea contributed to the conversation, no longer silent, no longer hiding. Across the cafeteria, Garrett's usual table was notably empty. His suspension would last 2 weeks, followed by mandatory counseling and behavioral probation. In the weeks that followed, the story of what the school started calling the Cafeteria incident took on mythic proportions. Students who hadn't been there claimed they had been, the details becoming more elaborate with each retelling. But Thea didn't encourage the mythology, didn't bask in the attention. She returned to a version of her previous life, still quiet, still reserved, but no longer invisible. She had friends now, people who sought her out, who valued her presence. The transformation in the school's culture was gradual, but noticeable. Students were more willing to speak up when they witnessed bullying, more willing to sit with the isolated kids, more aware of the silent violence that had been so normalized. The administration implemented new policies, hired additional counselors, created reporting systems that actually worked. Ms. Washington personally checked in with Thea weekly, making sure she was adjusting, making sure no retaliation occurred. 3 weeks after the incident, Thea did something she hadn't done since her father died. She went to a gym, not to fight, not to compete, but to train, to move, to reconnect with a part of herself she'd thought was dead. She found a small MMA gym on the outskirts of Denver, a place similar to her father's gym, and spoke with the owner, a retired fighter named Miguel. She explained her situation, her history, her complicated relationship with fighting. Miguel listened carefully, then nodded. "Your father taught you right. Fighting is a tool, not an identity. You can train without competing, can stay sharp without seeking violence. Come by whenever you want. No pressure, no expectations." Thea started going 3 times a week after school, drilling techniques, hitting bags, rolling with other students who respected her skill and her boundaries. Kieran would sometimes meet her after, waiting outside the gym, and they'd walk to a nearby coffee shop and talk for hours. Their friendship was developing into something more, both of them aware of it, but taking it slowly, carefully, building something real on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine connection. Garrett returned to school after his suspension looking different. Gone was the swagger, the dominating presence. He moved through hallways keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact, sitting at the edge of the cafeteria rather than the center. His friends had scattered, Cole and Bryce distancing themselves, Tasha breaking up with him publicly via Instagram. His father had apparently been furious about the suspension and its impact on Garrett's college recruitment prospects, had punished him severely at home. The king had been dethroned, and everyone could see it. One afternoon during the 6th week after the incident, Thea was leaving the library when she encountered Garrett in the stairwell. They were alone, the hallways empty during 7th period. Garrett froze when he saw her, actually flinched backward as if expecting an attack. Thea stopped, maintained distance, waited. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Garrett spoke. His voice quiet, nothing like his former bravado. "I'm sorry." The words came out rough, unpracticed. "For everything, for what I did to you, to Kieran, all of it. There's no excuse." Thea studied him, seeing not a monster but a person, someone damaged and struggling, someone who'd hurt others because he was hurt. "Why?" she asked simply. Garrett leaned against the wall, looking exhausted. "My dad. He's always pushing. Nothing I do is ever good enough. I wasn't getting enough playing time on the team, my grades were slipping, and he just kept pushing, demanding more, criticizing everything. And I guess I needed someone weaker to push around, to feel powerful, because I felt so powerless at home." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out you weren't weak at all. You were strong enough to take everything I threw at you and still not become like me. That's real strength." Thea absorbed this, understanding that hurt people, that Garrett had been both perpetrator and victim. "I accept your apology," she said carefully. "But accepting it doesn't mean I trust you. Doesn't mean we're friends. It means I acknowledge that you're taking responsibility and trying to change. That's a start." Garrett nodded, seeming to understand the boundaries being set. "Fair enough. And Thea? Thank you for not really hurting me that day. You could have. Everyone knows you could have. But you didn't, and I don't think I would have had that kind of control if our positions were reversed." They parted without further words, each heading in opposite directions, their brief connection acknowledging possibility for change without promising redemption. Later, Thea told Kieran about the encounter, and he listened thoughtfully. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked. Thea considered the question. "I think people can change if they choose to, if they do the work, if they're held accountable. But wanting to change isn't enough. You have to actually change, and that's harder." The remainder of the semester passed in a blur of normalcy that felt revolutionary to Thea. She maintained her grades, continued training at Miguel's gym, deepened her friendships, and navigated the delicate evolution of her relationship with Kieran. They went on their first official date in early December, dinner at a small Thai restaurant, followed by a walk through downtown Denver's holiday lights. It was cold, their breath misting in the air, and Kieran had offered his hand, and Thea had taken it, and it felt natural, right, like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. On their second date, at a movie theater showing a retrospective of classic films, Kieran had asked about her father, really asked, wanting to understand that part of her history. Thea found herself talking more openly than she ever had, describing the gym, the training, her father's philosophy, his sudden death, her mother's struggle, their move to Denver. She explained the promise she'd made, the reasons for it, the way she'd been trying to honor her father by rejecting everything he'd taught her about fighting. "But I realize now," she said slowly, working through the realization as she spoke, "that he didn't just teach me to fight. He taught me discipline, respect, control, when to act and when to walk away. I was honoring him by defending myself and showing restraint. The fighting wasn't the point. The control was." Kieran had listened intently, his hand warm around hers in the darkened theatre, and when she finished, he'd simply said, "Your father would be proud of you." "I'm sure of it." And Thea had felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for 2 years, the weight of guilt and grief lifting slightly, making room for something else. Acceptance. The school year continued, winter settling over Denver, snow accumulating in parking lots and on football fields, students bundled in coats and scarves. The social ecosystem at Lincoln had rebalanced itself, new hierarchies emerging without Garrett's dominant presence. Cole and Bryce had found new friend groups, quieter circles where they weren't enforcers. Tasha was dating someone from another school, seemed happier, less performative. And Thea had carved out a space for herself that was neither invisible nor dominant, just authentically present. In February, Ms. Washington called Thea to her office again. For a moment, Thea's stomach dropped, worried she'd done something wrong, but the administrator's smile was warm. "I wanted to let you know that we've received several requests from students asking if the school might start a self-defense program. They've specifically requested you as an instructor or consultant." Thea was stunned. "Me? But I'm just a student here." Ms. Washington nodded. "Exactly. You're someone they trust, someone who's demonstrated both skill and restraint. Obviously, we'd need proper supervision, certified instructors to actually run the program, but students want your input on structure and philosophy. What do you think?" Thea thought about her father's gym, about the working-class people he'd taught, about giving people tools to protect themselves without encouraging violence. "I think I'd like that," she said slowly. "My father always believed everyone should know how to defend themselves. But he emphasized that knowing how to fight means you rarely have to fight. I could help with that message." Ms. Washington beamed. "Perfect. We'll set up a meeting with some local martial arts instructors and start developing a program. This could be really positive for the school culture." The self-defense program launched in March, meeting twice a week in the gymnasium after school. Miguel from Thea's gym agreed to lead it, bringing 2 of his senior students as assistant instructors. Thea served as a student liaison, helping design the curriculum, demonstrating techniques when appropriate, and most importantly, explaining the philosophy behind the training. "Knowing you can defend yourself changes how you move through the world," she told the first class, which included nearly 30 students of all sizes and backgrounds. "You carry yourself differently. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, and that confidence usually means you never have to use these skills, but if you do need them, they're there." The program was hugely successful, with students reporting feeling more confident, more aware of their bodies, more empowered. Several students who'd been previous victims of bullying found particular value in the training, discovering inner strength they hadn't known existed. And the ripple effect was exactly what Thea and Ms. Washington had hoped for, a school culture that increasingly valued respect, boundaries, and standing up for others. Kieran became Thea's official boyfriend in April, a development that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. They were a steady presence together, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes, supporting each other's goals and dreams. Kieran had started making short films, and Thea was his most frequent subject and collaborator, helping him think through shot composition and narrative structure. He'd even made a short documentary about her father's gym in Philadelphia, interviewing some of his former students via video call, editing it into a beautiful tribute that made Thea cry the first time she watched it. "Your father's legacy isn't just the techniques he taught," Kieran said, as they watched the final cut together. "It's the philosophy, the values, the way he showed people they were worth defending, and you're continuing that legacy in your own way." Thea leaned against his shoulder, feeling grateful and sad and hopeful all at once. "Thank you for this." for understanding what he meant to me, for helping me see that I don't have to choose between honoring him and being myself. In May, as the semester was winding down, Thea witnessed something that tested all her growth and principles. She was walking through the parking lot after training, headed to meet Kieran, when she heard shouting. Around the corner of the building, partially hidden by cars, she saw Garrett being confronted by 3 students from a rival school visiting for an away game. They were bigger than him, older, and from their posture and words, they were looking for trouble, looking to hurt someone. Thea's first instinct was to walk away, to let Garrett face the consequences of whatever had led to this confrontation, to remember the months of torment he'd put her through. But then she heard one of them say something about Garrett's sister, something crude and threatening, and she saw Garrett's face, not arrogant or confident, but scared, genuinely scared, facing a situation he couldn't bully his way out of. And Thea thought about her father's lessons, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about choosing to be better than circumstances demanded. She stepped around the cars into view, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, her presence immediately drawing attention. "Hey!" she called out, her voice calm but carrying clear authority. "This is over. Leave him alone." The 3 students looked at her size, and started laughing. "What are you going to do about it, little girl?" the leader asked, stepping toward her aggressively. Thea didn't respond verbally. She simply set down her gym bag, adjusted her stance slightly, and let her body language communicate everything they needed to know. Something about the way she moved, the absolute lack of fear in her expression, the controlled readiness in her posture, made them hesitate. The leader glanced at his friends, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Whatever. Not worth it," he muttered, and they backed off, walking away while throwing insults over their shoulders, but not engaging physically. When they were gone, Garrett stared at Thea in disbelief. "Why did you help me? After everything I did to you?" Thea picked up her gym bag, considering the question. "Because you were in a situation you couldn't handle, and those guys were looking to really hurt you. What you did to me was wrong, and I'll never forget it. But I'm not going to stand by and watch someone get beaten up when I can prevent it. That's not who I am." She paused, then added, "But Garrett, if you ever go back to being who you were, if you start hurting people again, I won't intervene next time. This was a one-time thing because I believe you're trying to change. Don't make me regret believing in you." Garrett nodded, his throat working as he swallowed emotion. "I won't. And Thea, I know sorry isn't enough, might never be enough, but I am. Truly." Thea nodded once, accepting the words without absolving the actions, then walked away to meet Kieran, leaving Garrett standing alone in the parking lot, processing his second chance at becoming a better person. The semester ended with a surprising development. Thea was nominated for the school's Courage Award, an honor given to one student each year who demonstrated exceptional bravery or integrity. When Ms. Washington called her to the office to tell her, Thea's first instinct was to decline. She didn't want attention, didn't want to be held up as an example, didn't want a spotlight on what had been the most painful period of her life. But Miss Washington explained that Sienna had nominated her, along with several dozen other students who'd signed the petition, and they'd written statements about how Thea's actions had inspired them to be braver, to stand up against bullying, to find their own strength. At the award ceremony in late May, in front of the entire school assembly in the auditorium, Thea walked across the stage to accept the plaque, while her mother and aunt and Kieran cheered from the audience. She hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't expected to say anything, but when she reached the microphone, words came naturally. "I don't feel particularly courageous," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "For months, I was silent, invisible, taking abuse without fighting back, but I learned that there are different kinds of courage. There's the courage to fight when necessary, but there's also the courage to show restraint, to choose mercy over revenge, to help people even when they don't deserve it. My father taught me that real strength isn't about dominating others or instilling fear. It's about protecting yourself and others while maintaining your humanity. That's what I tried to do, and I hope that if any of you face situations like I did, you'll remember, you're worth defending, you deserve respect, and standing up for yourself doesn't mean losing who you are. The applause was thunderous, and when Thea returned to her seat, Kieran squeezed her hand and whispered, "Your dad would be so proud." Thea's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, feeling for the first time that maybe she had honored her father's memory after all, not by rejecting his teachings, but by understanding them more deeply than she ever had before. The final day of school arrived warm and sunny, students spilling out of Lincoln High's doors towards summer freedom. Thea walked out with Kieran, Sienna, Felix, and her other new friends, feeling lighter than she had in years. They made plans for the summer: beach trips, movie marathons, training sessions at Miguel's gym, road trips to the mountains. Normal teenage plans, the kind Thea had never imagined having when she first arrived at Lincoln back in August. As they reached the parking lot, Thea saw Garrett in the distance, getting into his car. He glanced over, caught her eye, and raised his hand in a small wave. Not friendly exactly, but acknowledging, respectful. Thea nodded back, a simple acknowledgement that they'd both survived the year, both learned hard lessons, both had the opportunity to be better going forward. Then he drove away, and Thea turned back to her friends, ready to step into a summer full of possibility. That evening, alone in her room, Thea sat on her bed with her father's gloves in her lap. She traced her fingers over his signature, remembered his voice, his lessons, his love. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you were trying to teach me, Dad," she said quietly to the empty room. "It wasn't just about the techniques or the discipline. It was about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and having the courage to live by those values, even when it's hard. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out." She carefully placed the gloves in her gym bag, no longer locked away out of guilt, but integrated back into her life with understanding and purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kieran, looking forward to summer. And next year, and honestly whatever comes next, as long as we're figuring it out together. Thea smiled, typed back, "Same. Thank you for seeing me when I was trying so hard to be invisible. Thank you for being patient while I figured out how to be myself again." The response came quickly. "Thank you for being brave enough to stand up, not just for yourself, but for what's right. You changed Lincoln High, you changed me. Can't wait to see what else you do." Thea set down her phone and walked to her window, looking out at the Denver suburb spread before her, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the city. She thought about everything that had happened since she'd arrived at Lincoln. The pain, the fear, the isolation, but also the growth, the friendships, the self-discovery. She thought about the person she'd been, broken, hiding, trying to honor her father by rejecting essential parts of herself. And she thought about the person she was becoming, strong but compassionate, capable but not aggressive, willing to stand up for herself and others while maintaining her humanity. The following Monday, Thea returned to Miguel's gym for what had become her regular training session. She wrapped her hands carefully, the ritual meditative and grounding, then spent an hour drilling combinations on the heavy bag. Miguel watched from across the gym, occasionally offering corrections, but mostly letting her work. Afterward, as she unwrapped her hands, he approached. "You've found your balance," he observed. "Training without competing, staying sharp without seeking violence. Your father would recognize what you've accomplished." Thea nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "I spent so long thinking I had to choose between being a fighter and being a good person. But they're not opposites. The discipline, the control, the respect, those are what make a good fighter and a good person. It's the same foundation. Miguel smiled. Exactly. And now you're teaching others that lesson, showing them by example. That's a powerful legacy to build. Over the summer, the self-defense program Thea had helped develop expanded, with Miguel offering additional classes for community members beyond just Lincoln High students. Word spread about the program's philosophy, its emphasis on confidence and de-escalation rather than aggression, and soon students from other schools were asking if they could participate. Thea found herself increasingly involved, demonstrating techniques, sharing her story when appropriate, helping others understand that self-defense was as much about mental preparation and awareness as physical skills. One particularly meaningful moment came in July when a small, quiet girl around 14 approached Thea after a class. "I just wanted to thank you," the girl said shyly. "I've been dealing with bullies at my school, and I was starting to think something was wrong with me, that I deserved it somehow. But hearing your story, seeing how you handled everything, it helped me understand that it's not my fault. And learning these techniques has made me feel like I'm not helpless anymore." Thea felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You were never helpless," she said gently. "You just needed tools and permission to use them. Remember, the goal is never to fight. The goal is to be confident enough that you rarely have to. And if someone is bullying you, tell an adult, report it, document it. Don't suffer in silence like I did." The girl nodded seriously, and Thea saw in her expression a determination that reminded her of herself, the decision to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. In August, just before the new school year started, Thea and Kieran drove out to the mountains for a day hike, wanting to squeeze in one more adventure before classes resumed. They found a trail that wound through pine forests and opened onto stunning vistas of snow-capped peaks. At the summit, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, with the world spread out below them, they talked about the year ahead. "Do you think it'll be weird going back to Lincoln?" Kieran asked. "After everything that happened with your reputation now?" Thea considered the question. "Maybe a little. But I'm not the same person who started there last August. I'm not trying to be invisible anymore. I have friends, I have you, I have a purpose with the self-defense program. And I know who I am now, which makes everything else easier." She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the silence between them, the ease of being with someone who truly knew and accepted her. "I'm proud of you," Kieran said quietly, "not just for the big moment in the cafeteria, but for all of it. For choosing not to let bitterness define you, for showing mercy when you could have chosen revenge, for turning your pain into something that helps other people." Thea smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I couldn't have done it without you. You saw me when everyone else looked through me. You stood up for me when it would have been easier to stay quiet. That mattered more than you know." They sat together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Thea thought about her father, about the lessons that had seemed so confusing and contradictory after his death, but now felt clear and purposeful. Control is everything. Fighting is a last resort. True strength includes knowing when not to fight. Mercy is harder and more powerful than revenge. These weren't just martial arts principles. They were life principles, guides for navigating a world that often felt hostile and unfair. When the new school year started, Thea walked through Lincoln High's front doors with her head up and her shoulders back, no longer the ghost she'd been. Students greeted her in the hallways, teachers smiled and said hello, and she responded naturally, comfortably, no longer trying to disappear. Her schedule included advanced English, where she and Kieran would continue analyzing literature together, and she'd been asked to be a teaching assistant for the self-defense program during 7th period, working with Miguel and Ms. Washington to expand the curriculum. The school felt different, or perhaps Thea felt different, or perhaps both things were true simultaneously. There was a visible shift in how students treated each other, more awareness of bystander responsibility, more willingness to intervene when someone was being mistreated. It wasn't perfect. Lincoln High was still a typical school with typical teenage dynamics, but it was better, noticeably better, and Thea knew she'd played a role in that change. During the first week back, she saw Garrett in the hallway between classes. He was walking alone, no longer surrounded by followers, his demeanor humble and careful. When he saw Thea approaching, he pressed himself against the lockers to give her space, his body language deferential, almost apologetic. Thea paused beside him. "How was your summer?" she asked, her tone neutral but not hostile. Garrett looked surprised that she'd spoken to him at all. "It was educational. My dad made me volunteer at a youth center, working with at-risk kids, trying to teach me empathy, I guess." He grimaced. It worked, though. Seeing kids dealing with actual problems, not manufactured high school drama, put things in perspective. Thea nodded. "That's good. Growth is good." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Garrett, I meant what I said. You have a chance to be better. Don't waste it." He nodded seriously. "I won't. And Thea, thank you for giving me that chance. A lot of people wouldn't have." Thea offered a small smile. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, but only one. Make it count." As the semester progressed, Thea settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and even joyful. She maintained her grades, continued training at Miguel's gym, deepened her relationships with friends, and navigated the delightful complications of being in a real relationship with Kieran. They studied together in the library, went on dates to movies and concerts, spent hours talking about their dreams and fears, and everything in between. It was the kind of normal teenage experience Thea had thought she'd never have, and she treasured every moment. The self-defense program continued to grow, with new students joining every week. Thea found real satisfaction in teaching, in watching nervous students gradually gain confidence, in seeing them stand taller and move through the world with less fear. She shared her story when appropriate, explaining that self-defense skills were important, but that avoiding fights through awareness and de-escalation was even more important. "The best fight is the one that never happens," she'd tell new students, echoing her father's words. "But if a fight becomes unavoidable, you want to end it quickly, safely, with minimum harm to everyone involved." One particularly meaningful session came in October when a student named Rachel approached her after class, tears streaming down her face. "I need to tell you something," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "I was planning to hurt myself. Things at home are really bad, and at school people have been awful to me, and I felt completely hopeless. But then I joined this program, and I heard your story about choosing to be strong without choosing violence, about how you got through the worst time in your life by holding on to your values, even when it was hard. It made me realize I could survive this, that I could get through it without doing something permanent to myself." Thea pulled Rachel into a hug, her own eyes filling with tears. "I'm so glad you're still here," she whispered. "I'm so glad you chose to stay. You matter, Rachel. Your life matters." After calming Rachel down and making sure she had resources, counselors, trusted adults, crisis hotlines, Thea sat in Miguel's office and cried, overwhelmed by the realization that her story, her pain, had potentially saved someone's life. Miguel handed her tissues and let her process. "This is why we do this work," he said quietly, "not just to teach people how to throw a punch or escape a hold, to teach them that they're worth defending, that their lives have value, that they can survive terrible things and come out the other side stronger." Your father understood that. You understand it now too. November brought an unexpected development. A local news station contacted Ms. Washington, wanting to do a story about Lincoln High's innovative anti-bullying program and the self-defense classes that had become a key component. They specifically wanted to interview Thea, having heard about her role in starting the program and the incident that had prompted it. Thea was hesitant, uncomfortable with the attention, but Ms. Washington and her mother both encouraged her to do it. Your story could help students at other schools, her mother pointed out. It could help administrators understand how to address bullying more effectively. This isn't about you seeking attention. It's about preventing other kids from suffering like you suffered. The interview was filmed in the gymnasium during a self-defense class. Thea demonstrated techniques while explaining the philosophy behind the program, then sat down for a more personal conversation about her experiences. The reporter, a kind woman named Diana Chen, asked thoughtful questions that didn't sensationalize the violence but focused on the lessons learned and the positive changes at Lincoln. "What would you say to students who are currently being bullied?" Diana asked. Thea thought carefully before answering. "First, it's not your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do justifies someone treating you poorly. Second, tell someone, a parent, a teacher, a counselor, anyone who will listen. Don't suffer in silence like I did. Third, document everything. Keep records, save messages, note dates and witnesses. And fourth, remember that this is temporary. High school feels like forever when you're in it, but it's not. You will survive this, and you will be stronger for having survived it, and someday you'll be able to help someone else going through the same thing." The segment aired in mid-November and was picked up by several other news outlets. Suddenly, Thea was receiving messages from students at schools across Colorado and even other states, thanking her for sharing her story, asking for advice, describing their own struggles. It was overwhelming, but also deeply meaningful. She answered as many messages as she could, always emphasizing the same themes. You matter. Tell someone. Document everything. This is temporary. You will survive. The ripple effect continued through December. Other schools started reaching out to Miguel about implementing similar programs. Ms. Washington was invited to speak at a state education conference about Lincoln High's approach to bullying prevention. And Thea, who had started the school year trying to be invisible, found herself reluctantly becoming a symbol of resilience and constructive change. At Christmas, Thea's mother gave her a special gift, a photo album she'd created, filled with pictures from her father's gym. There were photos of Thea as a small child in tiny gloves, photos of her first competitions, photos of her father teaching, beaming with pride at his students' successes. The final page held a letter her father had written shortly before his death, addressed to Thea, found in his desk when they were cleaning out the gym. Her mother had kept it, waiting for the right moment to share it. Thea read the letter through tears. "Dear Thea, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I want you to know that everything I taught you about fighting, about discipline, about control, it was all about helping you navigate a complicated world. The techniques are just tools. The real lesson was always about character, about choosing who you want to be when faced with difficult situations. You will face bullies, obstacles, people who want to bring you down. How you respond to those challenges will define you far more than the challenges themselves. Be strong but compassionate. Be capable but not cruel. Defend yourself and others, but don't become an aggressor. Show mercy when you can, because mercy is a gift you give to yourself as much as to others. I'm so proud of the person you're becoming. Whatever path you choose, walk it with integrity. Love, Dad." Kieran held Thea as she cried, reading the letter over her shoulder, understanding without words the profound impact of receiving her father's final message. "He knew," Thea said through tears. "He knew exactly what I'd need to hear someday. He knew I'd struggle with when to fight and when to show restraint. He was still teaching me, even after death. She clutched the letter like a lifeline, feeling her father's presence in the words, feeling his guidance in the lessons she'd finally learned to apply. The new year brought renewed purpose. Thea doubled down on her training, not preparing for competition, but maintaining her skills, staying sharp, honoring her father's legacy through daily practice. She continued teaching at Miguel's gym, finding joy in helping others discover their own strength. Her relationship with Kieran deepened into something stable and mature, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. And at Lincoln High, she'd become someone students looked to for support, wisdom, and proof that survival was possible. In February, on what would have been her father's birthday, Thea organized a memorial training session at Miguel's gym. She invited her mother, her aunt, Kieran, her friends from school, and anyone from the self-defense program who wanted to attend. Miguel led them through drills and exercises, explaining the philosophy behind each technique, emphasizing control and discipline and respect. Afterward, Thea shared stories about her father, about his gym, about the community he'd built through teaching people to defend themselves while maintaining their humanity. "My dad used to say that a black belt doesn't make you dangerous, it makes you responsible," Thea told the assembled group. He believed that once you knew you could handle yourself in a fight, you had an obligation to avoid fights, to de-escalate, to walk away whenever possible. Not because you were weak or scared, but because you understood the potential consequences and chose peace. That's what I'm trying to carry forward. His belief that true strength includes knowing when not to fight. The room was silent when she finished, everyone absorbing the message. Then her mother stood and hugged her tightly, whispering, "He would be so incredibly proud of you. You've taken everything he taught you and made it your own, used it to help others, turned your pain into purpose. That's the best way to honor his memory." Spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. Thea was asked to speak at a regional conference on bullying prevention, sharing her story alongside administrators, counselors, and other students who dealt with similar issues. The experience was nerve-wracking but ultimately empowering, standing in front of hundreds of people and explaining how Lincoln High's approach had worked, what made their program effective, what lessons could be applied elsewhere. During Q&A, an administrator from another school asked, "What would you say was the turning point? When did you go from being a victim to taking control of the situation?" Thea thought about the question carefully. "I don't think there was one single moment. It was gradual, built from a lot of small decisions. Every day I chose not to retaliate. That was exercising control. Every time I stayed true to my values despite provocation, that was taking power back. The moment in the cafeteria when I finally defended myself physically, that was important, but it wasn't the whole story. The real turning point was internal, when I realized that I could honor my father's memory by using what he'd taught me, not by hiding from it." After her presentation, several students approached her privately, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, seeking hope. Thea listened to each one, offered what wisdom she could, and connected them with resources. One girl, visibly bruised with a black eye she tried to hide with makeup, whispered that she was being abused at home, that she didn't know who to tell or how to escape. Thea immediately found a conference counselor, stayed with the girl while she made her initial report, ensured she had support and a safety plan. Later, alone with Kieran, Thea broke down crying again, overwhelmed by the weight of other people's pain, the responsibility of being someone others look to for guidance. "You can't save everyone," Kieran said gently, holding her. "You can't fix all the broken things in the world, but you can help, person by person, moment by moment. That's enough. It has to be enough, or you'll burn yourself out trying to do the impossible." Thea nodded, knowing he was right, grateful to have someone who understood the complicated emotions that came with being both survivor and advocate. As graduation approached, Thea reflected on how much had changed in a single year. She'd arrived at Lincoln High broken, traumatized, trying to disappear. She was leaving with genuine friendships, a healthy relationship, a sense of purpose, and the beginnings of healing. She'd faced her worst fears, confrontation, violence, vulnerability, and survived not just intact, but stronger. She'd learned that her father's teachings weren't a burden to hide from, but a gift to embrace and share. The week before graduation, Ms. Washington called Thea to her office one final time. "I wanted to tell you something before you leave Lincoln," the administrator said. "What you did here, standing up for yourself, showing mercy, helping create positive change, that's going to be part of Lincoln's culture going forward. Students will hear your story, learn from your example, hopefully make better choices because of what you demonstrated. That's a legacy most people don't create in a lifetime, and you did it in a single school year." Thea felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't do it alone. You supported me, Miguel trained me, Kieran stood by me, other students found courage to speak up. It was all of us together." Ms. Washington smiled. "True leadership is recognizing that change is collaborative. You're going to do remarkable things after you leave here, Thea. I'm certain of it." Graduation day arrived warm and sunny, the ceremony held outdoors on the football field. Thea sat with her classmates in alphabetical order, separated from Kieran, but able to see him several rows ahead. When her name was called, she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, and the applause was loud, sustained, genuine. Students she'd never spoken to cheered for her, teachers beamed with pride, and in the audience her mother and aunt were crying happy tears. After the ceremony, during the chaos of photos and goodbyes and celebration, Garrett approached her one final time. "I just wanted to say congratulations," he said, keeping his distance respectful of boundaries. "And to tell you that I got accepted to a state school, not the big-name school my dad wanted, but a place where I can study social work. I want to work with at-risk youth, try to help kids who are dealing with the kind of stuff that was making me lash out, try to do something positive with my second chance." Thea smiled, genuinely pleased. "That's great, Garrett. Really. It takes courage to acknowledge your mistakes and work to make amends. I hope you find what you're looking for." They shook hands formally, closing the chapter on their shared history, each moving forward on better paths than where they'd started. That evening, after the graduation parties and celebrations wound down, Thea and Kieran drove to a hilltop overlooking Denver, watching the city lights spread out below them like a constellation. They'd both be attending colleges in Colorado, close enough to see each other regularly, committed to maintaining their relationship while also growing as individuals. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, his arm around her shoulders. Thea leaned against him, comfortable and content. "I'm thinking about my dad, about how he'd see everything that happened this year. I spent so long thinking I had to choose between fighting and being a good person, but he taught me they're not contradictory. Fighting, when necessary, can be an act of protection, of love, of standing up for what's right. It's the intent and control that matters." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm also thinking about everyone I've met this year who's been struggling with similar things. All the students who reached out after the news story, all the people in the self-defense program, that girl at the conference who was being abused. There are so many people suffering in silence, thinking they're alone, thinking they deserve it. If sharing my story helps even one of them, then everything I went through was worth it." Kieran kissed the top of her head. "Your dad gave you skills to defend yourself physically, but what you've done is bigger than that. You've shown people how to defend themselves emotionally, how to maintain their humanity in the face of cruelty, how to be strong without being violent. That's a different kind of martial art, and maybe an even more important one." As the stars began to appear overhead, Thea thought about the journey ahead. College would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new versions of the same fundamental struggles between standing up for yourself and maintaining your principles. But she felt ready now, equipped not just with physical skills, but with emotional wisdom, not just capable of defending herself, but committed to defending others, not just surviving, but thriving. She thought about the lunch tray, the incident that had changed everything. In the moment, it had felt like losing control, like breaking the promise she'd made to her father. But she understood now that defending Kieran, defending herself, refusing to be victimized any longer, that had been the ultimate expression of her father's teachings. He'd wanted her to be strong and controlled and compassionate, to know when to act and how to act, without losing herself in the process. She'd done exactly that. "I used to be scared of who I might become if I used violence," Thea said quietly. "Scared I'd become like the people who hurt others. Scared I'd lose my humanity. Scared I'd dishonor my dad's memory. But I realize now that having the ability to be violent and choosing restraint, that's where real strength lives. Anyone can lash out. It takes discipline and character to show mercy when you could choose revenge." Kieran squeezed her shoulder. "Your restraint that day in the cafeteria, when you had Garrett beaten and chose to stop, to help him up instead of humiliating him. I think that moment changed Lincoln more than the actual fighting did. Everyone saw that you weren't interested in domination or revenge. You just wanted peace. That's powerful." As midnight approached and they prepared to head home, Thea took one last look at the city spread out below, thinking about all the people down there facing their own battles, fighting their own demons, trying to survive their own high schools and workplaces and families. She hoped some of them would find their way to people like Miguel, to programs like the one at Lincoln, to communities that would teach them they were worth defending, and that defending themselves didn't require losing their souls. In her mind, she heard her father's voice one more time, the core lesson he'd spent years teaching her, the truth she'd finally learned to embrace. Control is everything, Thea. Not controlling others, controlling yourself, your reactions, your choices, your commitment to being the person you want to be, regardless of how others treat you. That's the highest form of martial art. That's true mastery. She'd arrived at Lincoln High as a ghost, invisible and silent and scared. She was leaving as herself, strong but compassionate, capable but not cruel, skilled but committed to peace. The journey between those two versions of herself had been painful and difficult, had required confronting her worst fears and breaking the protective walls she'd built around her heart. But it had been necessary, transformative, ultimately worth it. As they drove home through the quiet streets, Kieran's hand warm in hers, Thea felt something she hadn't felt since before her father's death: peace. Not the false peace of avoidance, of hiding, of pretending problems didn't exist. Real peace, earned through struggle, built on a foundation of self-knowledge and hard-won wisdom. She knew who she was now, knew what she was capable of, knew what she stood for. And that knowledge, that certainty, was armor far more effective than any physical skill. The following week, Thea returned to Miguel's gym for what had become her regular training session. As she wrapped her hands, the ritual, familiar and grounding, Miguel approached with an envelope. "This came for you," he said. Inside was a letter from the girl at the conference, the one who'd been being abused at home. She was safe now, living with relatives, getting counseling, starting to heal. "Thank you for listening," the letter read. "Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for showing me that I could survive, and that surviving wasn't weakness, but strength. You saved my life that day." Thea's hands trembled as she finished reading. Miguel put a fatherly hand on her shoulder. "Your father would be proud beyond words. You've taken what he taught you and turned it into something bigger than fighting, bigger than self-defense. You've created a legacy of compassion backed by capability. That's rare and precious. Over the summer before college, Thea continued her work with the self-defense program, which had now expanded to include multiple locations across the Denver area. She trained regularly, maintaining her skills, but more importantly, she continued sharing her story and her father's philosophy with anyone who would listen. Each person she helped, each student who found confidence through training, each victim who learned they were worth defending, all of it felt like honoring her father's memory in the most meaningful way possible. On what would have been her father's next birthday, Thea visited his grave for the first time since moving to Denver. She brought flowers and her worn training gloves, sat on the grass beside his headstone, and talked to him like he was there listening. She told him about the year she'd had, the challenges she'd faced, the lessons she'd learned. She apologized for taking so long to understand what he'd been trying to teach her, and she thanked him for giving her tools that were so much more than techniques, tools for living, for navigating a complicated world, for being strong without being cruel. "I'm going to keep teaching, Dad," she said quietly, tracing her fingers over his name carved in granite. "I'm going to keep sharing what you taught me, making sure people understand that fighting is about protection and control, not aggression and domination. I'm going to make sure your legacy lives on, not just in me, but in everyone I can reach. That's my promise to you now, not to never fight, but to fight wisely, to fight only when necessary, to fight in ways that honor your teachings." As she sat there in the quiet cemetery, a warm breeze rustling the leaves overhead, Thea felt her father's presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of who she was. His lessons weren't separate from her. They were woven into her character, informing every decision, guiding every action. She'd integrated them finally, stopped resisting them, stopped treating them as a burden to hide from. They were a gift, precious and powerful, and she would spend the rest of her life proving worthy of that gift. When college started in August, Thea dove into her studies with renewed purpose, majoring in psychology with a minor in criminal justice. Planning to eventually work with at-risk youth and domestic violence survivors, she continued training at a local MMA gym near campus, continued teaching self-defense classes as a volunteer, continued sharing her story with anyone who needed to hear it. The work was challenging and sometimes emotionally exhausting, but it was meaningful in ways that made the difficulty worthwhile. Kieran, attending a different college but staying close, remained a constant source of support and love. They navigated the challenges of maintaining a relationship while growing as individuals, learning to balance independence with partnership, supporting each other's dreams while pursuing their own. It was the kind of healthy, mature relationship Thea had never imagined having, built on mutual respect and genuine friendship, strengthened by shared experiences and complementary values. Years later, after completing her education and beginning her career working with youth programs and domestic violence organizations, Thea would sometimes think back to that day in Lincoln High's cafeteria, the moment when everything changed. The lunch tray slapping from her hands, Garrett's arrogant smirk, the decision crystallizing in her mind that she was done being a victim. It had felt in the moment like breaking, like failure, like betraying her promise. But she understood now it had been transformation, necessary and profound. She'd learned that strength without compassion was merely brutality, that skill without discipline was just violence, that power without responsibility was tyranny. She'd learned that showing mercy didn't make you weak, it made you strong enough to choose differently, brave enough to break cycles of violence, wise enough to know that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. She'd learned that honoring her father's memory wasn't about never using what he'd taught her, but about using it wisely, sparingly, with full awareness of consequences and commitment to using minimum necessary force. Most importantly, she'd learned that suffering didn't have to be silent, that victims could become survivors, could become advocates, that one person's courage to stand up could inspire others to do the same. She'd learned that true strength was complex, fierce but not cruel, capable but restrained, powerful but compassionate. She'd learned that you could be a warrior and a peacemaker simultaneously, that those identities weren't contradictory but complementary. Standing in front of a new group of students at a community center, watching nervous people file in for their first self-defense class, Thea saw herself in their faces, scared, uncertain, hoping to find something that would make them feel safer in an often unsafe world. She smiled warmly, remembering how it felt to be in their position, and began the class the way she always did, not with techniques or stances, but with philosophy. My father used to tell me that learning to fight should make you less likely to fight. Not more, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Because once you know you can handle yourself, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You move through the world differently. You're not seeking conflict, not backing down from necessary confrontation, just existing confidently and peacefully. That's what we're here to learn. Not how to hurt people, but how to protect ourselves and others while maintaining our humanity. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. Not whether you won the fight, but whether you remained who you wanted to be throughout it. As the class began and students started learning their first basic techniques, Thea thought about Garrett, now working as a youth counselor in another city, using his experience with bullying to help troubled kids find better paths. She thought about Kieran, now her husband, making documentary films that highlighted social justice issues and gave voice to marginalized communities. She thought about the countless students who'd passed through her programs over the years, carrying forward the lessons, spreading the philosophy, creating ripples of positive change in their own communities. She thought about her father, gone but never forgotten, his legacy living on, not in trophies or titles, but in the lives changed, the confidence built, the violence prevented. She thought about the scared, silent girl she'd been at Lincoln High, and the strong, compassionate woman she'd become, and all the difficult, painful, necessary steps between those two versions of herself. And she thought about a lunch tray, slapped from her hands in a calculated act of humiliation, the moment when silence ended and transformation began. The moment when she'd learned that some things were worth fighting for, that standing up for yourself and others wasn't aggression but necessity, that mercy and strength weren't opposites but partners. The moment when she discovered that being her father's daughter meant not rejecting his teachings but understanding them deeply enough to use them wisely. As the first class session ended and students filed out looking slightly more confident than when they'd arrived, one young woman lingered behind. She was small, maybe 19, with visible bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes. "Can I talk to you?" she asked quietly. Thea nodded, recognizing the look, knowing what was coming, preparing to listen and help however she could. "My boyfriend hits me," the young woman whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to leave, don't know where to go, don't know if I'm strong enough to survive on my own." Thea took her hand gently, meeting her eyes with compassion and absolute certainty. "You are strong enough," she said firmly. "I know because I was where you are, not with an abusive partner, but feeling helpless and trapped and afraid. And I survived. I'm here. And I'm going to help you survive too, because that's what we do. We help each other. You're not alone anymore. Let's make a plan." As they sat together, developing a safety plan, connecting the young woman with resources and support systems, Thea felt her father's presence again, felt his approval, felt the profound rightness of this moment. This was what all the training had been for, what all the pain and struggle had prepared her for, not to be the toughest fighter or the most skilled martial artist, but to be someone who could help others find their own strength, who could stand beside the vulnerable and say with absolute confidence, You're worth defending, you're worth protecting, you're worth fighting for. And in that moment, teaching and helping and advocating, Thea Hollis knew she'd finally found her place in the world, not as a ghost, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as something more, a warrior for peace, a fighter for justice, a living embodiment of her father's highest ideals. The lunch tray had been the beginning, but this, helping others find their strength, their voice, their courage, this was the true purpose, the real fight, the most important battle she would ever wage. The quiet storm had finally found her voice, and she would use it to echo across generations. You are strong, you are capable, you are worthy of respect and safety and love. And when necessary, when all other options are exhausted, when peace has failed and protection is needed, you have the right to defend yourself, fiercely, effectively, and without losing the essential humanity that makes you who you are. That was her father's gift, her hard-won wisdom, her legacy to pass forward, the knowledge that true strength is choosing when to fight and when to show mercy, and having the courage to do both when circumstances demand it.